Hello everyone, today we talk about Saka, Kushan and Parni warfare. So really the heart of the Asian steppes in the late first millennium BC. We proceed with our series, in fact, on essentially Western, mostly Eurasian warfare. Today probably looking more east than in the other episodes. Given that we will observe a more conceptual side of the evolution of the art of war of Inner Asia, fundamentally, and of the Saka tribes and of the various peoples that also fundamentally emerged from them. As you will see, there is, of course, always a doubt about the origins specifically of this or that people, the Kushans, the Yuezhi, the Parni, and so on, because we don't have the actual information, right, laid out with precision, even by historiographical sources. But we understand, of course, it was much in common, and we will make the various distinctions along the way. But the more general outlook here is looking at a substantial step in the development of steppes warfare that brought to what is a bit more the stereotypical idea, right, of the effect of the local tactics and military culture in general, right? The shock charges of cataphract horses, so an impressive development of arms as armor, of course, and the relation that this had with the meeting of these nomadic peoples with the most sanitarized populations, right? Because what we see as something more typically Central Asian and sprung just out of the most hardcore steppe reality, etc., was the consequence, opologically speaking, of the encounter with the more heavily armored sanitary forces, and naturally the reaction of the steppe that surely had at the same time, if you want properly, a local traditional outcome, right, that we do not see quite in the sanitary world, if not by imitation of the same steppes at that point, but still, as we will see now, providing the very hardware, right, that became iconic for the steppe cataphracts as well. It's a vast area, also a considerable amount of time covered, as I reiterated often by starting the episodes of this series. This is not the most definite video on the topic. This is just a general outlook as an introduction related to the general warfare, right? And we will deal in detail with dedicated videos and basically everything about these people, properly the armor, the cataphract armor in this case, but also lighter one, the development of various peoples that regionally had substantial differences, and so on, how this affected, again, the warfare of sanitary populations, or other ethnic groups that at this point also start coming around, such as the Huns. So very complex issues that I will have to make tens, if not hundreds of videos on to be properly complete. Right. An interesting way of approaching this topic is looking at the encounter with the West. Right. We have the impression, I would say, when looking at steppes warfare, documenting a barbarian reality out of any civilized horizon, right? As if, first of all, we weren't the same product in many ways as Europeans culturally, of these constant waves of nomadic peoples that fundamentally shaped not just our culture but our genes, our the general profile politically and militarily, socially, what of the great peoples that we will see now also as successful conquerors were, in a sense, not necessarily striking back, but coming back a bit to the places of origin. It's unavoidable to talk about Alexander the Great and how the Macedonians, really crushing the Achaemenid Empire, came in contact with this a nomadic world that in the same among the same Persians was fundamentally a constitutive part of their culture, their rule, right? The Iranian ancestry, the substantially advanced equestrian warfare, etc. And that the Macedonians may have simply been influenced by themselves at home through, the Danubian Valley. The northern Thracians were pretty much, equestrian. Biased, we can say. The Scythians were fairly close. The other day I made that video about Scytho-Hellenic warfare, talking about the Scythians and the Maeotians, right? So they're actually much closer places than we think culturally, right? This could be extended, broadly speaking, across the steppes. The Sakas we see today, we're learning both from the Persians and the Chinese at the same point. And surely the Megas enterprise involved them, right, concretely, because the nomads had quite substantial ties with the Achaemenid Empire, right? You can argue that this was also felt in the broader Hellenic world before Alexander expanded it to the boundaries of the steppes in Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and so on, because notoriously in Bactria there were some Hellenic colonists, apparently Cretans, that the kings of kings had settled there, and that actually were not happy at all of the fact that a Macedon, so what in their view, at least at home, would have been considered a borderline Greek of some kind, by some kind of posh standards, would have come to, rule over them, preferring actually the Achaemenid rule to the Macedonian ones. This is something we will see in other videos. But what is important here is the actual confrontation between Macedonian cavalry and the steppes ones, and the astonishing realization that if it weren't for the fact that we're talking always, in any case, about combined armed tactics, actually would prove to be superior to the nomadic one, right? And in part triggering the changes that in fact we see in the following centuries. I'm not saying that, if Alexander had not literally changed, even in that kind of extremely radical way, the entire history of mankind, the Sakas and other peoples would have not developed their kind of more typical arms and armor that we know from the following centuries. But definitely these encounters did leave a mark, and what I always say when I talk about steppes history and warfare is that the nomads, but of course we don't know much about them because they didn't write, generally, and so we lack their side of the story. But they must have been much more aware, at least in a kind of, at least in what they would consider space, like, of the entirety of the Eurasian continent and the polities that existed from one side to the other than what, say, the Greeks or the Chinese or the Persians were about each other, right? For the simple reason that, as we've seen, the steppes peoples were much more pressured, right? They were just mentally more predisposed to be always on the move. They checked the pulse of all these various various polities to exploit any, in fact, useful chance to weaken, to raid, to plunder, and to, of course, that would consequently bring to some hybrids of sort, as we will see today. Right. So, as you know, Alexander fought. We are at the end of the 4th century BC. violently, to say the least, in the Near and in the Middle East. In the meanwhile, the Sakas were inhabiting the steppes of Inner Asia. Again, I thought I didn't need presentation. The Sakas are essentially Eastern Iranian peoples. They were a large group of powers that were called like this, by the Greeks, by the Persians, etc. So I already discussed in the other episodes the empiricism with which we kind of define ethnographically these populations, but they were fundamentally about the warfare we will describe today. Right, we're looking at Central Asia, Northern Hindustan, right, the one that would become part of the Sito-Hellenic world, right, with the meeting, in fact, of Alexander's successors and the Scythians in Bactria and in bordering areas, and that would take over the same Indian plains, which, part of them at least. And this is yet one of those other spaces in which you realize a lot of culture bridging was going on in terms, the Bactrian satraps of the Seleucid Empire were Buddhists, for example. There was quite a lot of contact with China, naturally, with India in the process. So I made a video about the Kushan, which is not Kushan, about the Tokharians. I did make, actually, yes, one video about the Sogdians, the Bactrians, and I think the Kushans in that video. I don't remember. You can find everything in the Steppes Warfare playlist. In any case, we will see all this stuff in detail in due time, hopefully. What has happened in these centuries would bring to, let's put it in this way, to maturity, right? Some dynamics that had already been evidently taking form in the steppes from a while, right? And that this magnitudinal event, if anything, of Alexander's conquests, and also naturally all the aftershocks all around, plus what was happening on the turbulent Chinese frontier, would trigger, right, among the sagas to change substantially their system of warcraft across an immense territory and for centuries to come. Essentially, up until the Turkic kind of wave, right, of the early Middle Ages, because their warfare was to impact, as you know, substantially. Made that video about the Sarmatians, even Western warfare, knightly, what consider as probably the medieval knightly mentality, culture, arms, armor, etc. The most intense clashes between the Macedons and the Sakas were at least two. The Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC and the Battle of the Yaxartes River, the Syr-Darya, 2 years later. Naturally, the first battle is the climatic one of the Macedonian-Persian wars that brought to the demise of Darius III, and however showed also the capacities of the Achaemenid forces, also thanks to the nomadic peoples that figured in large numbers, and especially on the wings of the Achaemenid forces, putting in serious difficulty the Megas on these occasions, right? During the battle, and I still have to make a video about that, you would see how the nomadic forces put, in fact, the Macedonian allied cavalry under substantial pressure, on both wings, right, with a consistent risk of having the Macedonian line collapsing entirely if this had not happened before, with after Darius abandoned the field, with the Achaemenid line and Alexander's attack, right? I do not have time today to digress on the details of the battle and the deeper implications, like of all the types of peoples, numbers, the tactics, etc. We're just told clearly by the sources that there was a substantial back and forth, right? First, successful charges from one side, the other, and that the Macedonian cavalry was about to be overwhelmed by the nomadic forces, especially because of the substantial degree of armoredness of these ones that, however, as we will see, had not yet developed what would be their kind of more advanced panoply in that regard, but that the Macedonian squadron's tactics, charging one by one, orderly, coming back, alternating these attacks on the longer run, because of greater, moral force and collective training, right, unit cohesion, succeeded in overwhelming the opponent. This is a very important lesson because here we're especially seeing an engagement that took place between cavalries only. At the Axartes, things went a bit differently, and combined arms were involved. But in this sense, do not underestimate what the sedentary equestrian capacities were at this point, especially the Macedonian cavalry, that was properly the only true feudal one in sedentary Europe, and that performed dramatically well in these contexts, naturally under the guidance of a exceptional commander. What you really do not appreciate about this war is that it was one of the few ones historically where there weren't, by considering the scale of the engagements, two equal commanders, right? Like a Scipio and Hannibal. There is a lot, of course, going on here. We can mention Bessus, right, the Bactrian leader, essentially the second in command in the Achaemenid army, that came exactly from these nomadic, semi-nomadic backgrounds. As we will see, there was a strong contact between these kind of frontier peoples formally within the Achaemenid Empire, just under their rule, and that once living further in the steppes, you can't quite tell where an empire really ends, territorially speaking. But the Sakas, right, under Spitamenes, for example, that had quite strong contacts with Bessus, right, would go on fighting against Alexander, not at Gaugamela, fundamentally today's northern Iraq, but as far as the Syr-Darya, and so an area between Uzbekistan to, we don't know exactly the place of where this was fought precisely along and across the river, but this is far north. This is basically almost the home of these peoples that Alexander had not just the courage, the determination of taking on, but also of defeating, right? And we're talking naturally about an undefeated commander, besides the greatest one in the history, of humanity. In this regard, what emerges in terms of still, cavalry quality is very educational, strategically speaking, because it shows you that it doesn't take to be either a Macedonian companion or a Saka nobleman just to say, I will win this engagement, right? Technological differences are really relative, and even more at this point in history, right? But still today, right? Wars are not won because of technology. If you want to think that the odds were balanced and technology made that 1% more, well, explain all the other 49%. So, it's a completely relative concept, and basically you can't even just, measure that, because war is, of course, about moral forces, right? Not about numbers, not about technology. It's about who actually goes on fighting, right, till they obtain what they want, and naturally with an outcome that must considered, however, also in function of the opponent's objectives in that regard. So I made a video about the relative value of victory and defeat, because this depends, of course, on what you're there for in the first place, what is that you want to do, and what is that you basically get from this, or not. But it's something I'm not going to discuss now, because at the end of the day, not just Alexander's empire fragmented soon after his death, and yes, there were other powers such as the Seleucid one and these other chunks, as we've seen, also autonomizing themselves further. The aforementioned Cretan colonists gave a boost to eventually the independent policy of even Seleucid Bactria at some point, but also because, as we've seen, the Senatory Empire is the Senatory Empire, and the nomadic peoples are the nomadic peoples, and so there is a precise boundary that sometimes you can draw. It's difficult to do in a politically speaking, just on a territorial base, as I countlessly, pointed out. Geopolitics does not exist, right? And if you think that there is actually, again, something to it, it's the same thing that I was talking about before for technology as well. So the terrain is not important, but the entire policy and war are about getting past that, because in case you didn't notice, borders change continuously, and things go on for so many reasons that obviously have nothing to do with a piece of dirt, right? Something that, by the way, among the nomads, it was even more readily evident, given that they didn't really have something they would call simply a fixed land of their own. They were quite prone to action, to movement, and to seizing any good opportunity to settle actually in the better places, right? And that's the reason why they were so warlike in the first place, because from the steppes they quite couldn't do it as easily as those who lived out there. Hence, in the sanitary world, and so being out there in the steppes, it was just the proof of, okay, we will not essentially be somebody else's subjects, even though of course it was a fierce hierarchy in the steppes, but we will try to seize our own opportunity in other ways, through other means, and still, with a substantial cultural difference, still in customs, in how they were habituated to live and to fight. That was definitely much worse than what happened in the sanitary world, but still, especially from a military point of view, very very dangerous for those living in the other side. Now, the presence also of nomadic cavalry at the time of the Persian Wars is probably an underrated aspect, right? We think much of the sense of the Greeks as Europeans defending their land from a horde of perverted Oriental hordes, right, of barbarians. Aside from the complete misunderstanding of the dramatic quality of Achaemenid military culture, if there was any Aryan on the battlefields of the Persian War. This was definitely from the Achaemenid side, with literal Aryans. I mean, the actual people of the Aryans, together with many others from this Iranian background, coming exactly from more or less the same places. As we've seen, there was sort of osmotic expansion, right? It brought from Central Asia this waves of more violent and hungrier and angry and just sense peoples to press also on the kind of on their brothers, their cousins, right, that had already settled somewhere. And in Europe, you can easily see that, as the western end of this steppes corridor, how many waves just from these videos. First, we talk about the Cimmerians, then we talk about the Scythians, the Maotians, and then we will talk about others, the Sarmatians. So it was all about this constant rejuvenation, right? A bit the entire mythology of the time revolved around this concept, right? This spring, even as the origin in the Vedic texts, in many, it's a bit like the concept of the Olympus, the great hyperboreal sea, right, of the north, where everything is light and cold and virile and orderly, right, from which force emanates, springs, and goes to conquer the material, right, the chthonic, the more sensual, soft and feminine south, right? So in the minds of these people, there was much about this, among those same sedentaries that would constitute that south, that were still, however, essentially about this beliefs from, especially the ones from Indo-European ancestry, in Europe, etc. But that, of course, in places like the ones inhabited from the Sakas, was basically the self-evident reality of how the world worked, naturally with many other limits, as we've seen, as far as the capacities of these peoples were concerned, but still not that they wouldn't put that effort to prove the loyalty to the original principle of action, right, and of force. The Battle of the Syr-Darya, of the Yaxartes, is another famous victory of the Megas, right? Who was substantially concerned of the possible, of course, infiltration and pressure that the Saka could make on the northern frontier of his newly conquered Hellenistic now empire. It was necessary to deter, right, to show what Alexander was capable of doing against the most advanced equestrian forces in the known world, in a territory, again, it was inhospitable, terrifying, environmentally speaking, incredibly, there was nowhere to centralize. So the what was needed to deter these peoples was to give them a shock that was much greater than the aforementioned kind of mentality of and what they naturally believed in a sense, is this sense of deeply ingrained superiority, morally believed, right, to the point that yes, they could have been defeated at the service of the Achaemenid army, but as far as their homeland was involved, right, nobody could have ever done this, right? After all, the same Achaemenids had tried to dislodge the Scythians from the Pontic steppes, and they had failed. The likelihood also Alexander succeeding in this case was pretty small. Naturally, this frontier would remain, and would remain tormented, so much so that the Seleucids at the end of the day will be overwhelmed, as we will see, at least on the northeastern frontier, by the Parni, and the Arsacids that came to lead them. And the Romans would have their problems too, but it was a problem that involved a bit everybody who lived even in this semi-sedentary Iranian plateau, right? The Parthians, the Sasanians later would try always to centralize, obviously, from Mesopotamia. That had a kind of a millenary urban civilization, was, richer, more kind of better suited for that kind of stable work, and they would use the Iranian plateau for breeding mostly their, again, very heavy cavalry, but also for settling, letting the peoples from the north, from which they act from the steppes, from which they actually descended themselves as leaders, at least, of those regions, the southern regions. I mean, nomads, right, and replenishing their cavalry with, again, pretty good quality one, just drawing from the spring of this type of warfare. Now, the Battle of the Exarchus is another very fascinating display of Macedonian equestrian capacity that, however, highlights, I would say, the civilizational difference between the Macedons and the Saka. For a simple reason. Essentially, the Saka were awaiting for Alexander on the other bank of the river, right? And they were in such a force that, was not capable of taking on the Macedonian army in open ground without exploiting this kind of advantageous, river natural barrier, right? Now, again, I will not digress on the strategic and tactical implications of, say, ratios of strength of that campaign. We will see it, hopefully, on another occasion. In any case, if the Sakas had successfully prevented the Macedonians to cross, they would have basically won the day, right? So what Alexander did was to organize a simultaneous crossing of all his forces. By the way, supported, covered by artillery throw, right? And the story goes that an arrow of these catapults pierced a heavily armored Saka warrior, proving a little bit, again, this is maybe a bit of that kind of Hellenistic technologism, for which, of course, it was not because of the catapults that the Macedonians managed to cross. It's because of their force and many other engineering, logistical capacities, and so on. But even this idea of basically nullifying, and consider the cost of that in sheer calories, right? The entire existence of a Saka warrior that basically was restlessly moving forever, like spending his entire life on horseback and learning carefully over the years, naturally with great risk, but again, an incredible series of invaluable knowledge that today, given that this lifestyles truly, for standards of the time, do not exist anymore, have been completely lost. And just, a crewman could simply pull a trigger, shoot this bolt, and transpass this guy, all his physical might and pride and whatever, and just, probably letting him just reflect on the the waste of his own life in the last time that this would have continued. Excited, definitely, and still excites our kind of a technologistic bias. Wasn't quite the case. First of all, behind that crew and behind that catapult, I just made some weeks ago a video about the early catapults at this point, exactly in the 4th century BC, and how they came to be, etc., and how much there was behind that, even just logistically, right? Bringing artillery as far as Turkmenistan at this point. With, again, this nomadic hosts carrying out scorched earth strategies, and, pulling that damn catapult costs a lot of energies. Again, there is a civilization behind that. But the most striking thing here is the following, that when the Saka saw that the Macedons were crossing en masse, so they wouldn't even, so all across the river with of the army, and so that the nomads could not simply concentrate their arrow fire on a single section of the fording, right, to try to keep the enemy at bay, because crossing a river, as you know, is one of the most delicate and dangerous of the military movement of military operations. They began to retreat, right, because they realized if they had stayed long, of course they exchanged some favor along the way with skirmishers, archers, and so on. But the bulk of the forces at that point was better retreated. Now, the problem is that as long as the Sakas could retreat, they could also come back, right? So Alexander, as we have seen, needed a major victory to crush this otherwise extremely proud people's spirit, which was already a titanic, a godlike enterprise, telling the truth, like just Alexander could carry out in that sense. What does Alexander do? He sends a body, right, of picked mounted lancers ahead of his crossing army, essentially to chase the Sakas. Right. In other words, he wanted to engage them and pinning them down for giving for time to his army to reach them and crush them. Right. The most interesting thing about this is that the Sakas were culturally alien to the concept of sacrificing a body of troops like that for a broader strategic goal, for the simple political reason. And so here the Clausewitzian paradigm, of course, is always confirmed, that if they had done the same, that is to say, used a bait of troops that, like Alexander was doing here, was literally sending in the mouth of the wolf, because they were cut out from the rest of the army was behind, and so against an incredibly mobile and agile enemy that could surround and slaughter them, right, just for the sake of it. And these troops, knowing that, could not be could have not been carried out by the Sakas, that otherwise would have incurred in an immediate feud, an immediate vendetta from the side of that group that they had let being massacred. They would have used as a bait and left behind and disappear, even if maybe the strategic situation would have, or the tactical, like in this case, would have favored it. And they basically wouldn't also let themselves losing at that point the opportunity of weakening an enemy, as they thought that would have, the thing was just like a foolish mistake. What really happened is that they did manage to encircle these forces that naturally were consistent enough to put up a substantial fight. So the Sakas were careful not even just facing them directly, because most of their forces were lighter troops, not just heavies. And so they encircled them. And these Macedonians let themselves practically being massacred. Actually, they would survive, at least part of them, as they held out until Alexander arrived with the entirety of the Macedonian army that had crossed the Yaxartes. So at this point, the Scythians, the Sakai, found themselves entangled in this engagement without, especially having surrounded the enemy, without being able to pull themselves out of that, to disengage, and suffered a crushing defeat at the hand of this also Macedonian combined arms, like the phalanx, intervened and did engage cavalry, just for saying that it's not like kind of total war battles. You set the skirmish mode and the the unit runs away every time the enemy approaches. Here we're talking about large amounts of troops that when you deploy in a certain area, when they remain squeezed between two other major forces like this, do not simply have the capacity of extricating themselves from it and are going to be crushed. They're going also to react, to defend themselves. And the Battle of the Yaxartes River is one of the greatest feats of Alexander. In one of those situations where the average Westerner, because of Vietnam War syndrome, thinks that, oh my God, it can never win, right? It's already lost, right? Those skirmishes in terrible ground against an enemy that retreats constantly. No, right? If you are morally superior, right, to another people, you are able to crush it, but for good, right? So you must want victory, which is something that everybody can do, naturally at a cost, and that's what war is about. But again, bailing out of that chance by simply saying, "Oh, it's lost," even before it's fought. Of course, it is a thought you should have politically in certain cases by calculating the odds and how much that is convenient to you or not in the first place. But wars are hardly something you can simply say, this thing will go that way in the first place, especially if the odds are fundamentally balanced, especially the larger the wars are, right? And so Alexander here proved, again, a divine standard of reasoning, and that's the reason why we remember him as the Magus in the first place. And needless to say, this defeat had a major impact on the other side, on the Saka. So we do not know, as we were saying before, from the words of these warriors, because they wouldn't leave us such information, but there must have been a substantial change in their mindset if we start seeing, not just because of Alexander, as we were saying at the beginning, but also because of him. So a guy, again, that could simply come there and crush the... you see how insulting the thing is. I mean, for these peoples at large, it would have been... they were not all under, of course, the Achaemenid Empire, but some of them had ended up there, right? And they were connected in this kind of Iranian mystical vision of universal empire, etc. That the Achaemenids were really the kings of kings. They were truly the imperial, the universal empire, right? This had been the case for, the Greeks had de facto developed, the Achaemenids did control the entire Ionian area, parts of the Balkans. They had developed within what was the Ecumenic Empire in Western Eurasia and beyond. So somebody that comes to crush this guy, basically somebody even more powerful than the guy you have already sold your independence to, right? So the shock, right, of what Alexander was able to achieve in those relatively few years on these peoples must have been enormous, as it was all over the West, and why Alexander's these lived on far and wide, right, in even more in Asia than in Europe, telling the truth, right? Especially Islam was even more obsessed with Alexander than the same Christian European world, right? And this is quite interesting to reflect on. Now, what did happen exactly is that not shortly after the Battle of the Yaxartes, they began to develop a much more costly defensive armor. So again, the causes are not entirely the episodes like of the guy, the heavily armored Saka warrior transpassed by a Macedonian bolt. It's something that goes beyond. It extends also because, as we've seen, the steppes themselves civilize themselves a little. There is more surplus, communication, kind of better routes are established, there are greater supplies, more surplus communicated locally. There are more powerful rulers that also come to rule over this sedentary world. as we've seen with the Indo-Scythians, we'll see later, etc. So these peoples are impacted by what they see happening at the outskirts of their world. And remember, your world is the steppes, right? So it's something in many ways diametrically opposite to what you see in the sedentary civilization, but also the latter are your prey by definition, right? So this costly armor, this full set of armor, that the cataphract, what the Greeks called the cataphract, came into use amid, and this is the most powerful indicator, the westernmost and easternmost Saka tribes. In other words, in the west, owing to the fight against the Persians and the Adochoi, in the east, due to their active participation in the turmoil on the northwest frontier of China. So in both cases, what we observe is actually a Persian, a Hellenistic, and from one side, and Chinese, respectively, achievement in the development of defensive arms that are borrowed by the steppes peoples, right? Yes, as we'll see now, many of the much of the gear, let's say, of the steppes, of the cataphract, warrior, etc., is fundamentally borrowed from these other peoples. As you know, I'm not much of a fan of the idea that, let's say, arms and armor are invented by one people and then the others are stupid because they didn't know how to do them, how to build them for themselves, or it's a much more complex thing. First of all, different arms and armor can't be developed at the same time in different places. You can never say in the world, even at this point, say across the Pacific, that there is no contact. Contact always exists. The world was already fully globalized, right? And everybody knew more or less stuff, right? And the problem is, again, technologism, because if you think that technology is simply something that enters a place, and so nobody knew about before, and that simply because of that it can't start being replicated, I think you're very far from history of science or economics, right? That technology can be developed and innovation occur only if there is an adequate field of application and doctrine and spin-off that can sustain that, right? So when we look here at the Sakas, fundamentally developing hardware, part of hardware, not entirely, as you understand, they already had their substantially effective arms and armor from a sanitary world, and some legitimately, as you understand here, the most developed military cultures existing at the time. They are mostly developing a military system that had already been emerging and it was now fully mature to be enacted, we can say. This aspect is, again, particularly important because the same hardware we're talking about, as you understand, we're in the 4th century BC, is not dramatically advanced, right? There is not much like anything different than a spear, an armor, a shield, whatever, with those kind of more or less material limits, and so on, right? What changes here is politics, is society, and all for reasons that were already intrinsic in the system of the steppes, and that we can also just barely document, unfortunately. But warfare, as you understand, is an important indicator. Why do I say this? Because, of course, gear of the type that would be normalized at this point among especially the Saka elite had already been around from a while, right? So this is also typical. Technology and this again, it's relatively simple technology, right? It could easily be manufactured, but the political and social conditions were not mature yet up to this point for supporting again a system capable of fully, innovating in that direction, and or say innovating even is a big word, as if there was properly a step, another unlocked feature, whatever. It's just an harmonious development that, however, accelerates. That definitely is designed to cope with more powerful systems as the ones that were also starting to appear in this outer world. I mean, think about the Macedonian phalanx. That's something that would rule around for essentially a couple of 100 years, and that was the military instrument of Philip II and Alexander III. And so, as we've seen, the one that managed to crush the most refined military force out in Western Eurasia, the astonishingly advanced Achaemenid army that never gets enough recognition for what it actually was, right? There were lots of myths, like some peoples, again, like a bunch of, fringe peoples carrying out guerrilla, and just, because a big empire backed out of that, say, oh my god, those were, we underestimated them. Instead, you look at massive and some of the most radically advanced military cultures in the history of mankind, like the Achaemenid Empire, and just because, I don't know, they lost the Persian Wars, said, oh no, they sucked, it's not like, the Neolithic phalanx or whatever, except, the Neolithic phalanx was a much more primitive system than the Achaemenid one, and also one provided with much less collective training and, kind of combined arms tactics and general efficiency per se. But of course, never mind that it was a theater of war, that everything takes place in the actual single contexts. We bailed out completely from the idea that there is anything good about the Persians, or at least, if we ever do so, it sounds like, the idea of kind of leftist multiculturalistic, oh my god, this empire is so multicultural, and we are the evil Westerners who do not understand how advanced the others were. No, in this case, they really kicked ass, right? And no, there is not, they weren't because they were multicultural in the way we, at least it's normally intended today or whatever. It's because they were a hell of a civilization, which is a completely different thing, right? In any case, the concept here being that surely the same Iranian world had been overrun by the Macedons, and this was impressive enough, even just for the Saka to notice. Of course, this wasn't happening just everywhere. As I said before, of course, news traveled very, 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 very fast. But this doesn't mean that everybody was as interested as knowing that. Like a guy in northern Siberia, he could have even heard about what was happening on the Yaxartes, but what the hell he cared about that, right? Who cared about this were the great rulers of the most powerful confederacies that had to take action, right, and eventually changing the life of really thousands and thousands of peoples under their control, to move here and there, to engage in this relation, to then things were pretty hot and messy there already, even without Alexander and other cataclysmic events of that kind. But the moral impression, that is always the most important thing. The Macedons didn't step in the steps, a bit of a word game, but they almost did that in that sense, and that was enough, right, for these peoples to be aware. That's the actual reason why just Alexander did that. It's just like, Caesar crossing the Rhine, exterminating a bunch of Germans, coming back, or invading Britain, showing off, crushing somebody here and there, and saying, look, that if we want, we can come there and kick your ass, right? And that's how they basically maintained goal for half of a millennium, right? And this is, again, yet another that it's almost a counter-insurgential kind of strategic mindset, right? And it's very important when you have to control such vast empires, and basically most of the time is spent either invading another country, and so attracting, say, people, business, getting wealth from it and redistributing it, and the other is putting down rebellions, right? For the sake also of showing what happens when somebody rebels, so that the others will not do it. This was the case because evidently from the steppes, yet many other nomads would have arrived, and surely Alexander knew that. But what was important for the balance of his empire is that at the moment, say in his generation, for this thing to have been settled, right? Then other things would change over time, but the level of unpredictability of even just a regional theater today is just 4 months on the basis of taking positive political action. It was pretty much the same in those times, except the show-offs were in relative terms much bigger, much more kind of epoch-making, and also because people attributed a sacred value to them, because objectively we cannot replicate it, right? We're a bunch of lazy apes with nuclear weapons, and we're just becoming weaker and weaker, right? What these people did, as we've seen, was a dramatically different thing on a regular basis. So another thing that strikes you about the Saka arms and armor development as heavy cavalry, at least in this heavier cataphract profile, is also the speed, right? How rapid it was, how this interaction of borrowed and local traditions put together the single most impressive equestrian capacities in the history of mankind. I mean, I'm not kidding, right? If you have to pinpoint the moment, the highest point in the history of cavalry, given the abilities, the consistency, not even the Mongols picked that, right? They were already kind of too modern, secularized to do that. Yes, even the Mongols of the 12th to the 13th century. The peak of human equestrian warfare is the Saka one of the end of the first millennium BC and the beginning of the first millennium AD. And it's, again, a new stage in steppes warfare, a new stage in steppes panoply. It consisted effectively of an armored jacket fitting at the waist with a high armored neck guard, brassards of steel or hard leather bands and rings, greaves, and a helmet. Right, the helmet was originally a cast bronze case, but that it was riveted or welded of several iron pieces. There was also an armored horse cloth, right, protecting the charger, whose head was also covered by a chamfron made of hard leather and iron. This is the cataphract as we basically come to know it, right? And it's an impressive display for a number of reasons. First of all, it's extremely costly. So whoever could afford this kind of panoply was extremely powerful and at the hand of substantially advanced military systems that evidently were developing in this direction also because of the increased combined armed tactics, right? Combined armed tactics intensify, right? Regarding the latter point, this was a bit also of a middle ground because, as I said in other videos, especially in Central Asia, what you find, I say Central Asia, always keep in mind what I said before, that this development mostly occurred on the frontiers with the most developed civilization. So, of course, in Central Asia, many things would be developed, including the stirrup, etc. But because, there were consistent problems even in maintaining certain kind of weapons. For example, we don't know much about how they rode into battle with a contus, with essentially a massive pole, used to, grab with both hands in order to, to pierce the person in front of them. But there was surely, and holding the reins, there was surely, and staying on horseback, because that's also the point. Probably was some way of literally fitting on the saddle in a substantial fashion. There were lots of straps. That's something we will see also a bit more, materially speaking, in another video. In any case, the hybrid still consisted in the sense that this heavy cavalry that started appearing in consistent numbers, even for being elite, entailed still a type of warfare that was still containing, had not separated fully, the shock charge element, the heavily armored one, and the horse archery, skirmish type of warfare, right? In other words, these would be guys so powerfully trained. This is also why I say this is literally probably the top of individual military training in the history of mankind. I'm not kidding about this, right? Collective training is another thing. Probably that was picked by the Romans, even just for the mindset of that, but the in a comprehensive way. But from an individual point of view, from an elite point of view, a Saka warrior, the 4th to 3rd century BC, an elite warrior, a cataphract, is again the peak of individual training in the annals of military history, right? So let's give a look to this armor and why it developed in this way. As we've seen among the Scythians, etc., armor had been developing in the form of some different pieces that often didn't even entail like a unique torso, let's say coverage. Let's put it in this way. There were plaques, say, on the shoulders, sometimes on the abdomen, and so on. Here, the entire guy gets basically locked into this armor, right? And especially the protection of the entire abdomen and torso is something that would remain in steppes armor basically ever since as a necessity, and that highlights increased combined arm tactics, especially as far as the lighter troops being capable, as we've seen at the Yaxartes, of encircling the enemy and hitting him from the flanks or from the rear, right? In Europe, just to make an example, we've seen it in some medieval arms and armor video. What you see in the time of in the first half of the 13th century is the appearance of plate armor, at least a metal plate armor. Actually, in some areas, like more influenced by the steppes, is like Hungary. There are some, for example, Byzantine chronicles that witness that with horses, chest places, chamfrons, etc. already by the 12th century Battle of Semlin. I'm not going to digress on it now, but the first piece of plate armor that develops is essentially a band, right, around the armor. These are all plates, right? It's a leather, it's an organic base. We have all plates siding vertically, and this thing is flexible enough for being closed on the back, and so forming this belt, right? The poles that had been more exposed already to steppes warfare had something like that you find even on the battlefields of the 18th of 19th century Poland at the time the wars were independence. In an organic material that was of the same anatomic shape for covering the abdomen, and that is probably, aside from a Mongol or Cuman influence, what this plate armor starts developing from in Western Europe, from the area of the Elbe River, the boundary of Eastern Germany, exactly at the time of the Mongol invasions, where as we've seen the hordes entered literally the kingdom, and that eventually will spread in the same years also in there, showing that Western metallurgy, armor, art of war was fully prepared for the spread of plate armor uniformly, homogeneously all over Europe in the same way. So nothing that we had just to learn, right? After all, it was the same type of armor as we've seen that existed in other organic forms that we can't even document, but now becoming of metal, so just more resistant. So that's how simple the concept really is, technologically speaking. Well, it seems to have been born here, at this point, right, with the Saka. And for this necessity of more protection, right, during outflankments and so on, considering that the heavier forces were basically deployed in the center, so they would have been the most acceptable ones they had just to charge straight, right? Of course, these individuals, as we've seen, could do everything. They were incredible athletes, massive stuntmen. They could do whatever on horseback, but if we're talking tactics, like in the larger numbers, this ultra-heavy cavalry elite can be employed exclusively in large numbers if you put it as a massive reserve in the center, in the rear of the formation, and then, after having softened up the enemy with all type of lighter troops that are coming from the subjects, peoples, and so on, you simply charge at the end of the day, even slowly, technically, because, with that sheer weight of horse, man, and relative armor all packed together, you can even, charge at a few at pace, right, and smashing to something, right? Admittedly, it was something even more brutal because, again, the sheer beefiness of both the knights and the horses here is that traumatically overloaded in training. It's something never seen in the history of mankind anymore, anywhere, right? So you would have been surprised by what they would have been capable of doing. And it's a huge deal. But in order to have the tactical role, you must be exposed to anything that comes from the rear, from the flanks especially. Of course, to the lighter troops that when this thing charges straight, simply get out of the way. This is the standard steps tactics. The Mongols do the same, right? At Lenitsa, the thing at Moi was different, but let's say Lenitsa is a good example of the fact that the Mongols didn't just open their flank because it was all a tactics, man. They could have simply attacked. No, if you are capable of meeting that charge of the heavier knights straight in the face, to overwhelm it, you do it. And you win big times, right? If you need to open this lighter troop, it's because these troops cannot objectively afford to resist to this thing. And so the only way you have to block these guys is to attract them into essentially this enveloping maneuver, double enveloping maneuver that counts on wearing the enemy out from the flanks, etc., and detaching cavalry from infantry, perhaps, which is also probably something that happened least often in sedentary war than we think, even when facing these nomads. So again, as we've seen at the Yaxartes, for example, with even the very slowly marching phalanx, as a matter of fact, formations that really had to be, even there, dramatically trained on foot to maintain alignment. So again, everything is calibrated specifically, and that's why the technological aspect is, after all, secondary, for the specific steps warfare. And this is not to say, naturally, that these troops were not suited against, say, even the sedentary armies. The problem is that these were also pretty much heavy, right? And the steppes didn't have this elite is probably even it's the most armored we can find. Even in the sedentary world, there is not such thing. Even though the Parthians actually, when they sedentarized, will develop, as we'll see now, some heavier forms. For example, the entire horse being cataphracted, but it's just something in between. The Sasanians abandoned that fundamentally. They just start taking away the rear part of the armor because it's too heavy, right? And they start. They do that because they also intensify the combined armed tactics. Right? We'll have to talk about Sasanian warfare. So, in a way, what we see in the steppes here is, again, something heroic, frontal, involved, and as we've seen, also both charge and still not tactically distinguished, occurring in the wake of the full Iranian kind of heroic tradition, but still something that considers a more intense type of warfare. So something, all this, for example, we just mentioned it, this armored jacket fitting at the waist, the high armored neck guard, right? This literal, again, collar that is made most evidently for stopping any kind of hit, not just arrows, but even lance hits from these massive knights in the neck, which is a huge deal. Admittedly, this is mostly anti-missile warfare, it seems, but never underestimate how aggressive these military cultures were for making also the weight of the entire knight being probably the smashing power that you need, right? Probably if this thing is launched full speed against a person that is hit standing like a footman, the person physically doesn't exist anymore, right? It's just like becomes a marmalade of some kind, or if it doesn't have it, it's just like a sack of potatoes being smashed completely, thrown away meters apart, completely broken. So the sense of impact and powerness, the Fergana horses, for example, the heavenly horses, treasured by the Chinese and bred in fact in the most protected and suited environment of Central Asia, the Fergana Valley, is exactly what will obsess even all these peoples, actually, the Persians, the Chinese, the Diadochoi, the Romans, right? When Augustus conquers Egypt, he wants, from, probably both, but probably the Ptolemies had it already there some way, a Fergana horse. Because, again, all the ancestral mythological meaning of the horses, the medium between heaven and earth, bringing the transfigured hero to heaven in the apotheosis, is the entire meaning of the history of mankind and the sole meaning of the imperium, and so it epitomizes everything, even in this form. Now, the point, though, regarding the connection with the sedentary peoples is that such a dramatically heavy cavalry is not to be found in overbearing numbers, right? These peoples can't really do their best. As far as the elite is concerned, that shows how compressed, how pressured, how somehow paranoid these people are in the steppes. But you do not see the system, again, taking over basically the most advanced ones. As we will see now, even the Parthian victories and battle like Kara, etc., these are not due to this specific elements nor of any specific strategic superiority of any kind. This remained the least devil among the two contendants, right? The same goes for China, etc. But there is no doubt a need from the sedentary peoples to imitate this ultra-heavy cavalry, right? And they, not with enormous success, right? As you know, the Roman cataphract cavalry was not really successful in most of its employments. Right? It was they artificially created some, or even the Clibanari, as a matter of fact, in the same Sasanian war that stemmed equestrianly from this background. We're not, right, so such that dramatically impressive force that first of all, in the sedentary world, infantry at that point remained the so-called queen of battles, right? So the Romans, the Constantinian army of the 4th century took down this Sasanian cataphracts, admittedly not without any problem, but still, in a way that was a bit, collective training over individualism. Again, the Sasanians were half a feudal system, right? Rome was really something else. Still at that point. So the question is really out of debate. But again, it's mostly for, and that's perhaps the greatest effort we have to make, is prevalently for the steppes environment that this armor is produced. The bronze casque is also naturally designed in such a way as would probably deflect all these various hits. Just think about the sheer amount of arrows that would fly during engagement between Sakas. Right, this is not just, admittedly, we would be surprised by the constant projectile crossing in the air in a normal battle between, say, I don't know, the Romans or the Macedonians, whatever. But for what arrows showers were concerned, in battles that we can easily count, would see, at least in the largest forces, hundreds of thousands, if not even millions, sometimes, of arrows shot. Well, you have to really make a great effort, because we have never seen, at least we have not documented this to an extent, at least the time we could film, photograph, whatever, if we had, as different powers already crushed, basically, steppes warfare for what it had been, right? And most of those nomads had already been, emarginated in some kind of the least desirable places of the steppes, but they were coming from that kind of background, and surely this type of armor is something that you find until, there are many anthropologists' pictures from the 20th century, from, say, Siberian peoples, etc. They are basically, say, if you look at, at the Navar or Longobard armor of the 6th century BC, AD, they were basically the same thing. Right, maybe a different material, could be metal, could be bone, it could be other stuff. I made a bit about lamellar armor, but fundamentally, right, the design remained unchanged in the essentials during the millennia. I made recently a video about Mongol heavy cavalrymen, made videos about Tibetan warfare and other stuff about Mongol warfare. You can see we have. I used 18th century. Tibetan armor, for example, for documenting the 13th century. Well, because we see they're the same, right? There isn't practically much of a change, because literally the politics and the society of the people wouldn't change so radically to make us say, well, it was another thing. They are the same. Naturally, also the protection for the horse is crucial here. Again, when I said that these heavy horsemen were still able to switch from the contest to the bow, we still have to consider that they were still overwhelmingly imbalanced towards the first role, right? So, as we've seen, heavier cavalry, slower cavalry is also, it's bigger cavalry, telling the truth, because it's, the animals are bigger consistently, because they need massive muscles in order to oxygenate faster, quicker. They're not good in terms of resistance over a long time. Of course, arguably some of them really were, because they were breeds really selected in some of the most nightmarish environments in the broader area, but they are meant to make just this temporary effort, right? The moment of the charge, and then hopefully at that point you would have smashed everybody that was in front of you, right? So that's also bigger, slower beast to ride in battle. This was about defensive weapons. What about offensive ones? By the way, shields were not so fancy anymore, because if you are so heavy, you most likely do not even need one. Of course, there were shields here and there for lighter troops, but at that point, at best you may have sort of buckler tied to your vambrace that is also armored. You see this kind of segmented armor on the arms are very typical, right? Very similar. They're present in the Hellenistic world, in in the Roman army, people think, oh, look, the Romans adopted the Manichae during the Dacian wars because they had to fight against their Amphias. Yes, because, that's really what happened. Like, really, we know the percentage kind of weapons involved. We know how the Romans in detail decided how to arm whom, like, well, yes, it must have been like that. That armor existed since ever. The Romans used it for gladiatorial games. It was surely around. It's found in many other places that have nothing to do, of course, with the Danubian frontier. It wasn't a novelty really for anyone at that point. You find it in the trophies of the altar of Pergamon, etc. In any case, surely it was a very effective form of protection, especially against these, as I understand, any kind of blows, really. And that was part of the defensive gear as well. But again, offensive weapons did undergo some changes as well, unavoidably. The bow itself that we described became tighter after the Eastern nomads. The Huns, the Saka began to make essentially the horns of their bows longer and face them with bow. I made a video about the composite bow, and what's the principle? It's the tender parts that can blend elastically, they can flex elastically in the inner side, and then you have this bone scales from the other side, and if you pull this, it's even a more compact bow, but it's very tough to draw and a hell of a useful range, right? The reason is in part to actually stay away from the sedentaries' polyurcetic capacities, for example. I mean, against the Adochoi kingdoms, ballistas had catapults had a greater range than the bows. That's part of the reason why the Sakas, the Exarchus had actually abandoned the rear banks, because they were under useful catapult shot, right? And consider there is the river in between, so it's a greater amount of it's a really greater range to the same bow. This may be one reason, right? Surely also the increased level of armor speaks of, as we've seen, while the Indo-Scythians were penetrating through Indostan and so on, and meeting also with rich cities, think about Takashila and so on. Well, yeah, they were defended by, catapults, stuff like that, and they would have wanted to be better protected in that kind of environment. As we said, the best armor was, as we've seen also in the previous episodes, was coming from the sedentary world, right? It was mostly just the nomadic elites that could afford having them imported and worked and just used for how much they cost in a substantially poor place like the steppes, right? So, but it's obvious that with an increased shock capacity and, of course, this increased armor, bows had to become more powerful. This is also the reason why bronze arrowheads were replaced at this point by the iron ones of a different size. As we've seen, the Scythians had this bronze arrows that were surely useful at the time of classical warfare against, say, the Scytho-Hellenic phalanxes to cause substantial damage. Now warfare had become more insidious, had become a bit more arms combined, as we've seen, and thus heavier, harder, bloodier, right? It had become also more technological just per se, and they needed to update as well. Again, we are talking about an incredibly large amount of people, of territory, so it was not the same everywhere, no doubt. As I said, what happens in the steppes sometimes is pretty weird. You find oases of dramatic, even technological advancement, even substantial wealth even maybe if they're semi-nomads or whatever, not necessarily, cities of some kind, like the one of the Tocharians and so on. In other areas that are maybe even close, but gravely underdeveloped, gravely poor, gravely, like, without even, metal at some point. But this is the best that the sagas really can produce, and there is really a lot of warfare going on in the boundary with the Seleucid Empire, with India, with China, right? So these warriors really are perfectly catching up with the major developments in the art of war at the time. As you can expect, iron swords became widespread and bigger, by the way. They substantially reflected, first of all, the greater need of these weapons as well, because, passing from bronze to sword is not necessarily, the best thing. It just means that there is also a kind of metallurgical development, but also the necessity of, let's say, development in some direction rather than another, and especially the necessity of producing more of these weapons. Properly the Iranian sword, what you see as also eventually influencing the Spartas in the West, and this blades that fundamentally remain straight, right, differently from the time of the Turkic-Mongolian era, where you see lots of sabers going on. And well, this indicates actually that in the Indo-European times of say the times in which the steppes were dominated by Indo-Europeans, was also an increase before the migration era, before this shattering of the world, the crisis also of the sedentary empire, so this general impoverishment of the entire Eurasia, steppes included. A substantial amount of wealth and kind of knightly direction, of feudal direction of the same steppes, where the warriors, the elites could afford even to have such an hallucinatingly expensive equipment, and needing to just fight against one another with these weapons designed as properly as bars to stick in the, not just to cut, but to enter, like stocks in the, in the parts of the armor, of the joints that, left say the part of, at least of the rest of the armor, weaker, right, and some parts even uncovered. So that's the direction that Saka warfare is taking at this point, especially in the areas, I would say, that really are they're more west than east, right? This is the impression I really get, because the least developed peoples at the time were in the east, and the Western Eurasian steppes were also a probably much greater frontier. They were more squeezed in terms of also trade routes. Let's put it in this way, that could also provide with this kind of wealth necessary to equip the warriors like this. And there were, let's say, multiple points, let's say, in which this frontier could afford for a gradual settlement that was not so dangerous, as opposed to the east, where the Chinese could launch massive expeditions, as you know, properly in the heart of Central Asia, to threaten even some settlements. So the idea is that, again, in this western area, the more Indo-European influence, there is also greater generalized wealth at this point in the steppes. It's also noteworthy, though, that the method of securing the Saka sword belt and accoutrement was borrowed from China, which is also fascinating. And part of the reason would be not much necessarily a greater technological development, China was very advanced. But the fact that, say, compared to Macedon or to Rome, China was much more of a feudal country than them. And this meant more heavier cavalry, and this is true. Comparatively, at least, it was also at some points it was a much more infested empire. Speaking of steppes peoples, because it would invade China with even internally to China with a frontier that didn't quite exist, let's say, in the same way in Europe. Also because it would have required entering areas that were much more savage, say covered in forests like Central or Eastern Europe, so you didn't really have just a simple access to albeit still a very layered frontier like the Chinese one. And so independently from the distance, this is not to do with the distance, this is likely to do with the fact that China had, because of that kind of more feudal direction, better sword belts and accoutrement styles and functionality and capacity, right? So the Sakas somehow were even just developing naturally models were similar, more similar to them, because they were also kind of going towards that feudal direction. Pommels, guards, loops, or scabbard sides, scabbard tips, that were often made of jade, were directly imported from China. That could be exactly for the same reason, that there was a Chinese elite that was substantially more showing off than, say, you don't hear these things about, say, as refined as it could be, say, in the Roman army, right? The Roman generals had still a more civic and, if you want, even more egalitarianly tribal concept of properly what Romanity was. And just yesterday we were talking about the Roman mentality in that regard, than Chinese oligarchs that really lived in a world that was much more about a divine race ruling and lots of other peasants just working for them. And I made something about the Hans. Admittedly, it would come in a couple of centuries to China, but again, as I was saying, it's more of much more of a feudal system than we think, compared to what we are habituated to in the West. Right? In the West, we may have been by some degree even more primitive than China, but in that sense, we were still more about a greater distribution of wealth per capita. Right? Indeed. Right? This was true in the Roman Empire for in the Italian peninsula until the 17th century, right? So China was something completely different and very distant from that also at this point. And probably also weaker politically and social, so that's why it was more easily penetrable, say, by even nomadic peoples, as opposed to Rome, that really lived and Europe in general lived a very brief time of this kind of occupation. At least, the migration era, you want to say, it starts from consistent movements of nomadic peoples from the fourth and fifth century, and they're mostly basically about semi-nomads at that point. Sedentaries turned a bit more mobile, like the Germans, right? And you find just some elements of like the Huns or the Alani, these other Iranian elements, but you don't find the constant hammering of the heart of Western civilization by nomads. There is no such thing, right? At best you find in more primitive areas like Central Europe, some areas of the Balkans and Eastern Europe, you find, again, yes, the Huns, the Avars, the Bulgars, the Magyars, but they do not settle in the heartland of civilization, right? So they remain always at the outskirts, and probably in areas that were somehow worse than the Chinese frontier for a nomadic warfare to also maintain itself over time. In fact, they got sedentarized pretty fast in many ways. So these comparisons are also necessary and interesting sometimes. Spears, as we were saying before, in the form of these double-handed grip barges, we could say, were much more functionalized properly for the first charge. I mean, the idea is becoming heavier, bulkier, longer, right, and functionalizing, specializing the charge as well, this massive knights. And as I said before, all these weapons had already been seen before. It was not the first time they were being used on the battlefield, right? But not just the Persian or the Chinese ones, but also the Scythian one, right? We find them, say, in the sedentary world, used by charioteers and infantrymen. We will see this hopefully in some historical military unit video, right? And they evidently had mostly let's say importantly, at least an anti-cavalry function, at least in the way they developed, mostly for mounted troops of some kind, right? I was just thinking about the Macedonian pikes, but those were also, they were stemming actually from another military philosophy, mostly connected with the phalanx of and Macedonian warfare, as you know, is a complete surpassing of hoplitic warfare. It's really about combined arms, and so it's mostly those troops in any case were designed to fight against preferably just other infantry, right? So it's during this 4th and 3rd century BC that in second warfare you can fully appreciate this set of arms becoming prevalent amongst the heavy cavalry, right? Again, this is not something you can find but in heavy cavalry, because it's what makes it heavy. So naturally it's contained in numbers. And such a powerful shock force could really give an edge on the battlefield. You could even, as would happen in the rest of steppe history and warfare, measure the power of a people, right? The richer, the more powerful the elite. Not necessarily the entire system had to be stronger, right? Usually the best, the most powerful peoples were the ones who were fairly balanced, also in terms of individual, say, of the average warrior's wealth in a way. But again, being a larger coalition, having lots of tributaries, and being able to field this ultra heavily armored elite was really an impressive indicator of power, right? The use of this set of weapons enabled, for example, the Saka and the Yuezhi to press the Xiongnu. The Saka and the Yuezhi fought substantially each other. We don't know much about the latter. If not, they were probably of Indo-European origin themselves, probably even of Saka origin themselves. In any case, they crushed the Sakas in their frescoes, etc. They represented themselves also, probably crushing what are Saka warriors, and we see even at that point again how generalized that kind of armor was from these iconographic representations. However, in the 3rd century BC, the Xiongnu took their revenge, and their western neighbors were forced to flee westwards. And among these ones, we find the Kushans, right? Again, it's very complex to make the entire history of, who were the Yuezhis, who were the Kushans, were the Saka. In any case, the Kushans are most famous for the vast empire that they built, essentially from a Yuezhi background, right? From Bactria, descending southeast, right, and stretching, therefore, from Central Asia to India, and injecting also an enormous deal of, that kind of equestrian culture further in the south, like more or less the same way that Indo-Aryan peoples had penetrated India from millennia. And fortunately for us, also enough, because Bactria in India, etc., have enough kind of surplus civilizational output to represent in somehow important detail the panoply of peoples like the Kushans, right? And so giving us basically actually the best, say, the not just some of the best iconographic evidence, but also the one depicting the essentially the drastic improvements that the Saka arms and armor had been impressively accomplished by this point, being really some of the heaviest, the actual heaviest you can imagine, right? Again, the very top of equestrian military culture in the history of mankind. We will surely talk about the Indo-Scythians, about Bactria, the Kushans, and so on. But what is important at this point is just highlighting the broader dynamic. Reason for which I would like to conclude briefly mentioning the Parna nomads. That would have been just one of the many peoples, again, living more or less in these areas, like their ancestral homeland would have been Turkmenistan, kind of some desertic area, which they moved from in the 3rd century BC, originating effectively the core of the Parthian kingdom, eventually developing in an empire that, as you know, began also in the shade of Seleucid rule, right? We have seen how the same Antiochus III imported cataphract warfare in the West, aside from what maybe the Scythians, the Sarmatians could be doing at this point from the steppes, but it would take substantial amount of time before the Romans did that, for example. Started around the 1st century AD by the famous Anabasis, right, of Antiochus the Great, which campaigned exactly in the same areas at the outskirts of what had been the Achaemenid and Alexander's empire, but in the same areas we were looking at before Alexander's expeditions. And that had so Parthians that had established themselves just essentially east of the Caspian Sea, right? It's an area that had come to Gemini's up to Hyrcania. What is interesting about Parthian warfare that we will see hopefully at some point in detail is that especially the latter areas, also towards the Iranian plateau, were full of infantry, right? So there was a consistent amount of Parthian armies that were that was on foot, really. But definitely the core, again, of the Parnian nobility stemmed from this Indo-Iranian background, right? That would gradually push and eventually crush also the Seleucid forces in battle, swarming in the Iranian plateau and reaching Mesopotamia, as we were saying before. So the Iranian plateau was enough of a bulwark to protect the country. The Romans would actually crush that a couple of times, fragmenting the entire Iranian plateau and causing dramatic changes, such as also the end of the Arsacids and the rise of the Sasanians. In the process, but an area could not quite be occupied. It's just even as the Byzantines would do later, right? Just another Persian empire would be reborn, again, limited in power. The Sasanian ones were so powerful because it had been capable of centralizing in Mesopotamia, taking over many other areas in Arabia and the Near East, even extending an influence on the Horn of Africa and having this very far reach all north and east, coping with other of these peoples, eventually the White Huns, the Ephthalites. Again, I made a video about the ethnic origins of the Huns, at least what we could. It was mostly not a genetic history video, but a reflection on the general cultural value of, let's say, what we think, what we need to think the Huns to have been. Right, it's something that in West we have often, strange about, right, for different reasons. But we will hopefully look at those genetic studies as well, however, because it's not really a mystery for anyone. And the history of Parthia, the history of conflict with the Romans, of Carrhae, of at the main, that at the peak of its power stretched from Turkmenistan, in fact, to Syria, right, and relying fundamentally on cavalry armies. In the paradoxically, they surpassed that infantry dimension later. I mean, when they were fighting against the Romans, mostly, they controlled so much territory that their elite was just mounted. They didn't need to rely also with ethnic complements, but on other sedentary. Admittedly, they did have infantry. Also, the Sasanians had actually a consistent amount of one, but say they developed that mostly because of what they managed to consolidate in Mesopotamia, not much because of the still useful Iranian infantries, the infantries of the Iranian plateau they could find in large numbers, but not being so impactful like their cavalry. Combined arms, tactics. The Parthians are the ones that developed the full cataphract here, right, with the horse entirely covered, right, in scale armor, and the embodying in this sense also a considerable traditional Iranian warfare that they could develop further, right, for eventually declining, because it became really too costly. And part of the reason of the elite being able to fight like this probably is the same one that prevented the development of other areas of their armed forces, such as poliorcetics. In fact, the Parthians were really laughed at during the ancient times because they sucked at siege warfare consistently, as they never abandoned that kind of nomadic mentality, in spite they ruled over extensive sedentary areas. But again, this tells you how also traditional they were in their type of warfare. So definitely their scaled armor is of the Persian and Scythian type that at some point confused themselves, right? Over time, over the centuries, the Parthian knights, exactly in the moment again in which the empire was in decline, so surely showing the hyper concentration of wealth in the hands of the elites and the general collapse of the rest of the skeleton of the system, began to develop this armor of large plates joined by thongs or iron rings, as well as a mail coat, right, which is something that we mostly credit to the Celts as early as the 4th century BC. But aside from the fact that we have Etruscan coat of mail that dates to the century before, and that even the area in which this Celtic armor was first found is in Slovakia, would suggest that mail armor had already been around. It had actually not been invented properly by the Celts, that surely developed it to the greatest extent in the Iron Age with other peoples. In fact, surely, like in this case, the Parthians at that point being influenced by them, but also by the Romans. Of course, they used it extensively, right? But that it may have actually been around, and that there wouldn't be anything strange if it had actually been invented, for example, in Eastern Europe, and maybe among the Scythians or the Sarmatians themselves. So the Scythians at that point were other peoples of, let's say, more coming from even from Central Asia. We don't have an archaeological evidence of this as far as I'm concerned, but the idea again that there was armor that had been around for a consistent while, and some people started developing it more consistently at some point, is a bit the same reason why we're looking at Iranian cataphracts that nobody else really had, except these cataphracts had their panoply developed from stuff that was used already in the sedentary world, right? So that's what actually makes even the superiority of a culture in a specific environment, right? For example, these peoples had dramatically advanced metallurgy at that point, and that's also something they had been gradually acquiring from the sedentary world and not somewhere else, right? So the heavier Parthian cataphracts had metal masks on pointed helmets, suggesting there that, again, knightly warfare was something pretty heavy, impacting. Faces had to be protected. This could suggest, actually, that Scythian warfare, like in the steppes, like the Sakas, would be less inclined to hand-to-hand combat than the Parthians were at this point, after they had been substantially sedentarized. Right, that's the reason why you do find metal masks even among the Romans, even among, medieval warfare basically encloses the same helmet. In the steppes you find less of that, though, usually, or at least you do have masks, etc. But most of the helmets remain really not so amble-big as the Western ones, in spite of the fact that armor was, generally speaking, heavier, or at least it was more developed in that direction. So this is fascinating because it could suggest more distance fighting and mobility than, say, the Western heavy cavalry. And in this sense, the Parthians, comparatively to their steppes neighbors, may have already followed that direction by hemming their and so with the fact that the Sasanians abandoned kind of heavier equipment, that the later Klibanari, in this sense, were lighter than the later Arsacid knights, relatively. Just most of the horse armor is the posterior part was the one that they lightened, but it's still meaningful. May show the also the necessity of not having a too sclerotized society politically. We're coming from a kind of revolution, kind of also, the Sasanians were much more inspired to the Achaemenids than the Arsacids really were. They surely had their full Arsacid Achaemenid legacy to collect. There is no doubt, but they also were, as we've seen, maybe a bit more feudally biased, right? Or at least they came to develop their system in a bit of a different way. And the Sasanians were the ones who recovered instead properly the grandeur and also the extension, or at least a greater extension than the Arsacid domination. So if you look also at Parthian swords, bows, and spears, you really realize that they derived, or at least they were quite similar to the ones of the Kushans. They were just their eastern neighbor in many ways, so there's nothing so strange about that. And so it was still a substantially broader Saka kind of legacy. So why are these centuries important? Well, because the millenary history of the tactics of, say, steppes, knights, mounted archers, lancers, and swordsmen had fully begun. Before this, the Scythians had been consistently lighter, consistently more heroic, consistently more primitive, consistently more tribal. At this point, the steppes start becoming more hierarchical. Right? There is surely also the seed of a crisis, paradoxically, right? And so do not underestimate even the reasons for the development of such a specific type of trooper, because this was just, again, an elite, and there were other elements that you must consider to have a full picture of how these military systems worked and how they consistently could interact with, internally, with how functional they could be and how effective on the field, in fact, they could really be. And so actually the history of the steppes is, from these indicators, much more tormented, even in the relation with the sanitary peoples and the necessity of remaining a formidable foe for these as well, than probably we usually think, right? Yes, these people, these nomads, were scary, they were aggressive, they were annoying, but they were also, as we all always say, they were actually the weaker side, right? They were the ones that had to realize that they were not the ones living in a more prosperous world, that they had that their only means to achieve that was raiding, plundering, and what occurred from Alexander the Great onward was also a great change in terms of probably the political compaction of polities, what could be achieved statally, professionally, by armies, right? Classical hoplitic phalanxes are not Macedonian phalanxes, pikemen phalanxes. The same goes for Rome and the Parthians, right? So there are some models that civilization develops, the world ages, and you have to cope with that. You have to stay afloat. You have to do basically your best not to remain hopelessly behind, right? It would take another millennium and a half before the steppes would be finally defeated, right? But again, the advantage that the sanitaries had always been more consistent politically and strategically, and always presenting a new challenge for these peoples to overcome. Alright, we will see how steppes warfare evolved, again, hopefully soon. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.